Ashes to ashes, dust to dust, once solid iron, is now only rust. It is but a cycle, through all things must pass, for rarely do the tangible continue to last. We look at these cycles and wish they would change, accepting this pattern. Somehow does seem strange. Few things are eternal, and one of them is love, now and forever, on earth and above. Welcome back. Today I have for you an assortment of creepypastas, popular urban legends, and scary short stories authored by ChatGPT. The first story is one I like to call The Cannibal Clan of Whispering Pines. It is written by AI. In the dense, fog-laden woods of Whispering Pines, a small town nestled far from civilization, rumors swirled of a family living beyond the reach of law and morality. Tales spoke of the Devlins, a clan of cannibals whose hunger for flesh knew no bounds. Late one autumn night, a group of adventurous teenagers, egged on by bravado and teenage folly, decided to investigate the legend. Armed with nothing but flashlights and nerves of steel, they ventured into the heart of the forbidden forest. As they trekked deeper into the darkness, the woods seemed to come alive with ominous whispers, and shadows danced in the periphery of their vision. Each step felt heavier, laden with the weight of unspoken dread. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream pierced the stillness, shattering their fragile courage. They stumbled upon a clearing where a dilapidated cabin stood, its windows like eyes staring into the abyss. Against their better judgment, they approached, drawn inexorably by morbid curiosity. The door creaked open, revealing a scene straight from their worst nightmares. The cabin's interior was adorned with grotesque trophies, human bones fashioned into macabre decorations, and the stench of decay hung heavy in the air. Before they could flee, a chilling voice echoed from the darkness. "Welcome, my darlings, to our humble abode," it hissed, sending shivers down their spines. The Devlins emerged from the shadows, their faces twisted into sinister grins, eyes gleaming with hunger. Trapped and outnumbered, the teenagers realized too late the folly of their folly. The Devlins descended upon them like vultures, their laughter mingling with the agonized screams of their prey. And as the night consumed their terrified cries, the legend of the cannibal clan of Whispering Pines grew darker still, a cautionary tale whispered by the wind to those who dared to tread where darkness dwells. This next story is an urban legend called Humans Can Lick Too. A 13-year-old girl was left home alone one night when her parents went out for a meal with friends. The parents thought that she was too old for a babysitter, so they decided she could stay home alone as long as she locked all the windows and doors as soon as they left. Usually she would have objected to being left alone. However, her parents had bought her a beautiful German Shepherd dog just weeks before. The reason for such a gift was because the girl had been suffering from nightmares for years. Having the dog sleeping in her bedroom helped her feel at ease. When her parents left, she went around the house making sure that all of the windows and doors were locked, as per her orders. She found that the basement window would not lock, so she locked the door leading into the house instead and thought nothing more about it. The time was 8 p.m., and she was to go to bed at 10 p.m. This was enough time to watch a film, so she put on one of her favorites and settled down to watch it. The dog came and lay by her feet for the length of the film. Feeling happy that she'd coped well with being alone at night, she decided she better head up to bed. Turning off all of the lights on her way upstairs, she saw nothing unusual in her home. Once upstairs, she brushed her teeth and changed into her nightwear. She snuggled under her duvet and dropped her hand to the floor to feel for her dog. Sure enough, he assured her of his presence with a loving lick. She smiled and drifted to sleep. In the midst of the night, she was woken by a dripping sound. Rolling her eyes, she assumed she hadn't turned the tap off properly in the bathroom. Trying to ignore it, she felt for the dog and received the lick that she was used to receiving and fell back to sleep. Only about half an hour later, she woke again to the dripping and annoyed that it kept waking her. She slumped to the bathroom to turn the tap off properly. Leaving the light off in order to not blind her eyes that were still half asleep, she tightened the tap and returned to her room. Feeling for her dog, she was greeted by the usual lick. Tremendously tired, she fell back to sleep and didn't wake until her parents returned home. The lights from the car shone through her bedroom window, and she was pleased that they were home. One thing shocked her, though. The dripping sound was still relentlessly going. Worried that perhaps the tap had broken, she walked to the bathroom to investigate fully. She turned on the light, and her scream pierced the silence. Her parents ran up the stairs to investigate her troubled scream, and they just stood staring into the bathroom. There was their beautiful dog, skinned and hanging in the shower, its blood dripping to the floor. On the mirror was the words, "Humans can lick too, my dear." This next story is a creepypasta called The Expressionless Ghost. In June of 1972, a woman appeared in Cedar Sinai Hospital in nothing but a white, blood-covered gown. Now this, in itself, should not be too surprising, as people often have accidents nearby and come to the nearest hospital for medical attention. But there were two things that caused people who saw her to vomit and flee in terror. The first being that she wasn't exactly human. She resembled something close to a mannequin, but had the dexterity and fluidity of a normal human being. Her face was as flawless as a mannequin's, devoid of eyebrows and smeared in makeup. There was a kitten clamped in her jaws so unnaturally tight that no teeth could be seen, and the blood was still squirting out over her gown and onto the floor. She then pulled it out of her mouth, tossed it aside, and collapsed. From the moment she stepped through the entrance to when she was taken to a hospital room and cleaned up before being prepped for sedation, she was completely calm, expressionless, and motionless. The doctors thought it best to restrain her until the authorities could arrive, and she did not protest. They were unable to get any kind of response from her, and most staff members felt too uncomfortable to look directly at her for more than a few seconds. But the second the staff tried to sedate her, she fought back with extreme force. Two members of staff had to hold her down as her body rose up on the bed with that same blank expression. She turned her emotionless eyes towards the male doctor and did something unusual. She smiled. As she did, the female doctor screamed and let go out of shock. In the woman's mouth were not human teeth, but long, sharp spikes, too long for her mouth to close fully without causing any damage. The male doctor stared back at her for a moment before asking, "What in the hell are you?" She cracked her neck down to her shoulder to observe him, still smiling. There was a long pause. The security had been alerted and could be heard coming down the hallway. As he heard them approach, she darted forward, sinking her teeth into the front of his throat, ripping out his jugular and letting him fall to the floor, gasping for air as he choked on his own blood. She stood up and leaned over him, her face coming dangerously close to his as the life faded from his eyes. She leaned closer and whispered in his ear, "I am God." The doctor's eyes filled with fear as he watched her calmly walk away to greet the security men. His last ever sight would be watching her feast on them one by one. The female doctor who survived the incident named her the Expressionless. There was never a sighting of her again. This next story is called My Two Encounters with a Hellhound. I've had a few different paranormal experiences in my life, but these are the only two occurrences I can remember that involved a beast of any sort. I believe I witnessed the same creature twice within a few days to a week of each other in my town. I'll begin with the first sighting I had. I live in a nice suburb of Metro Detroit. There aren't many large animals in the area, aside from deer. The only other animals in the area are your typical pets, squirrels, and an occasional fox or two for the most part. It's a pretty tame area. I was driving through the neighborhood leaving my girlfriend's around midnight last summer. As I was driving north on a street in the subdivision, something caught my eye from the very left edge of my field of view. It appeared to be a very large and well-built creature, hurtling from a backyard, on the grass, and into the street. I slammed on my brakes immediately in disbelief at what I was witnessing. It was moving extremely fast. I don't have a very good estimate, but I would say at least 40-50 miles per hour. The yard in which it emerged from was directly facing a short cul-de-sac that backed up to some trees and then more houses beyond that. I immediately turned right facing the court, so that my headlights would illuminate the path it seemed to be running. I was only able to witness it for a few more seconds, but I have no doubt in my mind that whatever I witnessed was real. The creature was very large. If I had to compare the size to another animal, I'd say it was about the size of an adult lion. The body type appeared to be that of a dog, although I've never seen any breed of dog this size, and there are absolutely no wild or stray dogs in the area. It had a pitch-black coat, and while I could slightly make out the shape of its head from the side, I never saw its eyes or mouth. When it ran past my headlights initially, it never acknowledged my presence. It did not turn and look at me, slow down, or do anything that was directed toward me. When I turned facing the court, I was only able to see the back of the creature before it disappeared into the backyard of the center house on the court and into the woods. Determined to get a better look, I drove recklessly, 40+ miles per hour, out of the court and around the bend to the street in which the yard would back up to, but it was already gone. I continued to drive home and tell my girlfriend about what I had seen. With no explanation, I kind of shrugged it off as just being a very unusual night. Now, this is what I believe was my second encounter with what I'm guessing was a hellhound. I don't remember exactly how many days later it was, probably about a week, but I went to smoke a cigarette outside my house around midnight. I typically go out through my garage and smoke on the side of my house next to the garage. I put on my shoes and walked through my laundry room to the garage door. As I stepped into my garage, I had a very bad feeling overtake me. It's the type of feeling you get when you think you're being watched or stalked. The hairs on my neck and arms stood up, and I felt a very eerie, sinking feeling in the bottom of my stomach. I paused, stood completely still, not breathing, to assess the situation. A few seconds passed, and I heard and saw nothing. I looked over to my right to see that the side door was completely shut, but something still did not feel right. There are two vehicles that stay parked that are for summer driving only. I look around and still don't see or hear anything. Then, out of what seemed like nowhere, the furthest vehicle from me begins to shake. I immediately think, oh, it's just a cat. But then I realize that there's no way any house cat in my neighborhood could cause the vehicle to move like that. That's when it went from scary to absolutely frightening. As the car is shaking, I hear the most horrific sound I probably will ever hear in my entire life. It sounded like an extremely deep growl mixed with high, alternating pitches of screeching all at the same time. The noise hit me at the deepest, most primal level and struck a level of fear I've never experienced. Even when I've faced life or death situations, and I've been held up at gunpoint before, I've never felt this feeling. It was deafeningly loud, and the vehicle began to shake even more. The noise was more horrifying than anything Hollywood could dream up. It sounded like whatever it was warning me to leave, but then began to get angered at my presence. I was too afraid to stay any longer, and immediately slammed the door into my house and locked both locks. I put a note on the door telling my brother to go out the front in the morning, as there's something in the garage, and it's extremely agitated. I ended up calming down and going to sleep without really worrying about it. When I woke up, I saw my note and kind of laughed at myself for being so afraid. I went out through the front door and walked around to the side of my garage. The door was still shut. I sighed and decided that it was daylight. There was nothing to be afraid of. I opened the door away from me very quickly. Before I could blink, a pitch-black creature sprinted out of the door. This time, it was not as large as my initial encounter, but moved faster than any animal I've ever seen in person. It appeared to be the size of a medium-large-sized dog, around 75 pounds, but the speed in which it was moving is inconsistent with any dog. Again, it seemed to be moving over 40 to 50 miles per hour, allowing me only to see it for a few seconds before it was over 50 yards from me disappearing into the woods. Again, with the second encounter, it never looked at me. I never got a glimpse of its face or its eyes. I never stopped to think that what I had seen might have been paranormal until today. When I searched the description, I was horrified to see it matched that of a hellhound. It seems the mythology behind these creatures is a bit contradicting. Omen of death, nothing may occur, or possibly a protector. But now I'm worried I'll encounter it for a third time. I always felt it was unusual that it never looked at me, but now I'm thankful that it seemed to consciously choose not to. Folklore says that if it looks you in the eyes 3 times, it's a guaranteed omen of death. So now here I am, and I don't know what to think. I feel confident that if this was a hellhound, it was not looking for me, but I don't know that for sure. This next story is called Daniel the Ghost. Daniel was 8 when he became a ghost, rising from the shallow grave where his stepfather had buried him in the woods behind their house. Daniel was happy to be a ghost because no one could hurt him anymore. So he wasn't scared of going back to the house, but he stayed out of their way, hiding in an alcove in the basement. Sometimes he would go up in the dead of night, poking around in the kitchen, and once he crept up to their bedroom and stood at the foot of their bed. His mother jerked out of sleep, sat up, and screamed and screamed. Daniel fled back to his hidey hole. They left that house soon after, and others came. But they didn't stay long either. As much fun as it is to imagine haunted houses, it actually isn't fun to live in one. And so families came and went, and Daniel grew more forgetful about how humans do things. Until Lily and her family came. Lily was often ill and couldn't get out and run around like others. Daniel heard it whispered through the walls that she may not live much longer. He wondered if she would become a ghost like him, perhaps joining him in his basement home. It wouldn't be terrible to have a companion in the dark and dreary basement. So, despite what had happened those years ago, his mother sitting up in bed screaming and screaming, her mouth an open black hole of suffering and misery, Daniel decided to visit Lily in the bedroom where she lay in bed. Lily couldn't sleep. Being often restless, she had heard the noises in the kitchen and the creak of the basement stairs. She had learned about the ghost of the missing little boy, of course, but being close to death herself, it didn't bother her. When her bedroom door swung open, she knew the boy was coming to her. But it wasn't a little boy who stepped into her room. It was a big one, almost a man. In the dull night glow, she could see him clearly, a lanky, tall young man with a pale face. She still wasn't scared, but quite confused. The young man looked at her, also confused. "Who are you?" asked Lily. Daniel remembered. "I am Daniel, a ghost." Although it had been years since he spoke, the words came to him naturally. Lily got out of bed and walked towards him. "Daniel?" She reached and gripped his wrist. They stared at each other, the young man bewildered as memories and futures ran through his mind. Lily said quietly, "You're not a ghost, Daniel." Warm tears squeezed their way out of Daniel's eyes. He remembered the earth, the air on his face, as he crawled out of his grave and started walking home, covered with dried blood. "You're alive." Lily drew the young man in and sat him down next to her, on the edge of the bed. They began talking. This AI story is one I like to call The Mirror Mansion. In the heart of the city stood an old mansion, its windows boarded up and its walls cloaked in ivy. Locals whispered of its dark past and the eerie legend that surrounded it, the tale of the Mirror Mansion. According to the legend, the mansion was once the home of a wealthy family who fell victim to a tragic fate. One stormy night, as lightning tore through the sky and thunder shook the earth, the family vanished without a trace, leaving behind nothing but empty rooms and shattered dreams. Years passed, and the mansion remained abandoned, its halls echoing with the ghostly whispers of the past. But it was what lay within the mansion's walls that sent shivers down the spines of those brave enough to venture near. A room filled with mirrors, each one reflecting not the world around it, but the darkness within. It was said that whoever dared to enter the mirror room would come face to face with their deepest fears and darkest desires, their reflection twisted and distorted until they no longer recognized themselves. Some claimed to have seen the ghostly figures of the missing family trapped within the mirrors, their silent screams echoing through the endless expanse of glass. Despite the warnings, there were always those who sought out the Mirror Mansion, drawn by the promise of unlocking its secrets. But none who entered ever returned the same, their minds forever haunted by the twisted visions they had witnessed. One fateful night, a group of teenagers dared each other to spend the night in the Mirror Mansion, eager to prove their bravery in the face of the unknown. As they crept through the crumbling corridors and climbed the creaking stairs, the air grew thick with anticipation, each step bringing them closer to their inevitable fate. Finally, they reached the mirror room, its door hanging off its hinges and its windows shattered by the passage of time. With trembling hands, they stepped inside, their breath catching in their throats as they gazed upon the countless mirrors that lined the walls. But as the hours passed and the darkness closed in around them, they soon realized the true horror of their situation. For in the twisted reflections of the mirrors, they saw not only their own fears and desires, but the malevolent force that lurked within the mansion's walls, a force that hungered for their souls. In a desperate bid for survival, they tried to flee the mansion, but it was too late. The darkness enveloped them, swallowing them whole and dragging them down into the depths of despair. And so, the legend of the Mirror Mansion lived on, a cautionary tale whispered in hushed tones by those who knew the true terror that lay within its walls. For in the darkness of the night, the mansion still stood, its mirrors reflecting not the world outside, but the nightmares within. The next story is a creepypasta titled Knocking. It started when I was 6 years old. I was in school, it was the middle of a reading lesson, and I needed to pee badly. At that age, actually, a fair few kids still wet themselves, and I always got paranoid about embarrassing myself in public like that. I stuck my hand up and told Mrs. Zebby that I needed to use the bathroom. After the usual speech about how I should have gone at break, she gave me the key to the disabled access toilet, as it was the closest one to my classroom. It was the middle of 5th period, and the corridors were empty and seemed cavernous to me. I was a short, scrawny thing back then. I sometimes had trouble with doors, especially unlocking them, and I fumbled for a good minute or two in trying to get the blasted thing open. Anyway, as I sat on my porcelain throne, there came a knocking at the door. "Someone's in here," I called, disgruntled at this disturbance. There came a pause, then the knocking resumed. It was faster now, more determined. "Wait a minute." The knocking slowed, and a voice replied, "Let me in. I need to come inside." The speaker's tone was thin and reedy, an adult I didn't recognize. I may have been 6, but I also had a fairly good understanding of bathroom etiquette. Mainly that you didn't let more than one person into an area only slightly larger than a cupboard. "Go away!" The knocking intensified again until it was a frantic drumbeat just a few feet from me and out of sight. I heard the voice shouting something, growing more and more desperate. "Let me in. Just open the door, please." I was terrified by that point. The hammering and yelling was so loud, and yet nobody had come to investigate it. Eventually, my teacher came to find me, angry because I had been gone almost half an hour. When I refused open the door to let her in, she got a spare key from the receptionist and then took me to the headmaster's office and called my parents. I was suspended for the rest of the week. I never told anyone what happened. It was a few weeks before my next encounter with this phenomenon. I had just celebrated my 7th birthday, and my family were having a barbecue in my honor. It was a gloriously sunny day, but as soon as we'd set everything up in the allotments behind our house, the coal refused to light. My dad asked me to go and get some fire starters from the shed in the front garden. It was pretty cramped inside, and I wouldn't fit all the way, so I just opened it up, stood on tiptoes to reach the shelf holding my objective, then shut the door. As I turned away, a frantic knocking hit the other side of the door. "Open up! I need to come through!" This voice was not the one I'd heard the month before. It was deeper, more brooding and angry. I said nothing and hurried away. I had no idea what was happening, but it frightened me. As I walked away, there came a final thump, like a fist being slammed against wood, and I heard his voice again. "You little bastard! I'll rip your fucking teeth out! Let me through!" I ran back to my party and spent the rest of the day glancing over my shoulder. As you might have guessed by now, there were a lot of these voices. I count at least 30, total. Every month or so, I used to get them, pleading to be let through doors. Almost always, it would be immediately after I shut the door behind me, as though these strange entities had been following me. I never told anyone, but to be honest, I kinda just got used to it. It always made me jump, and some of the voices would make me feel uneasy, but I knew that I was safe, so long as I did not open the door. Some of the voices I got used to the extent that I even named them. There was one which always used to appear at my front door, at home. We have frosted glass, and I could see a silhouette of an average-sized man wearing a cap of some kind. He never spoke, but occasionally would push envelopes containing blank pieces of paper through the letterbox. I called him the postman. He was one of the more unsettling ones. If I tried to speak to him, he would look up, sharply, then begin knocking. I generally left the postman alone. 20 years on, and I have retained as much normality as possible. I have plenty of friends, and I even have an on-and-off relationship with a girl I met last year. Not bad for a guy who wakes up in the middle of the night and listens intently to noises you can't hear on the other side of the door. Yeah, my buddies think I'm strange and kooky, but they put up with it. They're all great. I'll miss them. You see, things have started to get strange. Well, stranger than usual, I suppose. 3 weeks ago, I awoke, sweating and crying, though I do not know why. My dream had been, from what I recall, fairly normal, when a huge shadow had abruptly fallen over everything. Literally, the second I opened my eyes, there came the knocking at my bedroom door. Not just normal knocking, though. This was truly frantic. "Who goes there?" I yelled. "But please, help us," it replied. I was surprised. It was the sadistic, angry voice that I remember from my father's shed on my 7th birthday, but it seemed genuinely sincere. There was a pained tone to it too, as though the speaker were grievously wounded. I actually found myself pulling back the sheets to get up, but I hesitated. I had never before been tempted to open the door. I suppose as a child, I had so rigorously drummed into my head the idea that whatever lay beyond was evil, that it was just common sense. To be quite honest, I came very close to letting the thing into my room that morning. I held out in the end. It got worse. Just 2 days later, I was in my local corner shop. I'd just paid for a bottle of milk and a newspaper when a great force slammed against the shop door. Simultaneously, a voice began screaming, a long, keening squeal of pain. I whirled to face the door, but there were so many flyers plastered over the glass that I could only just make out the shape of a woman on the other side, slapping her palms against the window. The shopkeeper stared at me, as though I were crazy. In the end, I asked if he had a bathroom I could use, murmured some half-thought-out excuse, and hid there for 10 minutes until the screaming stopped. There were 4 more incidents between then and now, a mixture of screams and tearful begging. The postman stopped by yesterday too. He knocked politely, before sliding his usual letter through the letterbox. Then another. A total of 10 plain brown envelopes. The postman waited for a few minutes, knocking occasionally, and then he left me alone. Each letter contained a sheet of A4 paper, but somebody had taken a black pen to the pages, scribbling and shading them with such vigor that there were large tears around the center and the edges were frayed. I shoved them back into their envelopes and tried to put it from my mind. Earlier, my bedroom door shook violently. It wasn't a scream or a howl or a roar that I heard, though. It was just crying. Dozens and dozens of voices sobbing quietly. Another blow struck my door. Plaster flaked from the walls and twirled to the carpet. Still no pleas or bargaining, just sobbing. Crash. I jumped up from my chair. Crash. A hairline crack split the frame of the door in one corner. My phone began to ring, and I heard a sharp rapping at the glass of my window, behind the curtains. I tried answering the phone, but it was simply yet more voices crying. Not even sobbing, though, more like bawling in terror and anguish. I hung up, but it kept ringing, so I took the battery out. I have shoved most of my furniture against the door and window. It has been 3 hours since this latest attempt at entry began. The battering has not abated, nor has the crying. I'm fairly sure that my door won't hold much longer. As for my mediocre barricade, it could be swept aside in 2 minutes. I find myself faced with the very real possibility of death, so I am writing this memoir of sorts, just in case something does happen. Crash. What do they want? Crash. Do they even want to hurt me? Crash. They seemed fearless, even malicious before. Crash. What could have driven them to this? Crash. Maybe I should open the door. Crash. Maybe I should let them in. Silence fell. I realized that even the crying had ceased. For a whole minute, I sat there. Then I got up and hurried to my door, eager to escape this claustrophobic situation. Perhaps I'd go outside, where I could be far away from any doors and from the damned knocking. I pulled away my barricade and turned the handle. Locked. Kneeling, I peered through the keyhole. Beyond my bedroom door was not the corridor that I remembered, but another room. Some kind of library or classroom, I think. It seemed unoccupied, but for one kid, sitting and reading with his back to me. I banged on the door. Hey, kid. Let me out, okay? He glanced over his shoulder. Yeah, over here. Could you open the door, please? I can't. I'm in detention. I'm not supposed to talk to anyone. Go away. He turned from me. Confused and exasperated, I began to stand up. A loud bang shattered the silence once more. I realized it sounded like a fist being pounded against glass. My window. I heard it again. But this was not the frantic knocking of somebody wanting to get inside. This was not even an attempt to break in. Whatever was beyond the curtain and glass knew I was inside. It knew I was frightened. In the most predatory and sadistic way possible, it wanted me to be afraid. I turned back to the door and began hammering on it frantically. "Hey, let me in, okay? I really need you to open the door."